History now ties into Revelation. Not every event is scripted. Not every actor is consciously following prophecy. Not every war, panic, reform, crash, treaty, or institutional shift can be reduced to one hidden motive. That kind of thinking gets sloppy quickly. But the architecture still matters because it shows how a counterfeit system actually matures in history. And the boundary has to stay clean here. The claim isn't that every actor consciously knew prophecy. The claim is that history increasingly takes the shape of the kind of anti covenant order Revelation would judge. That's the responsible way of looking at this. That's the defensible way of looking at this. And it's strong enough because it doesn't require proving that every statesman, banker, merchant, cabinet, or institution knew what role they were playing inside of prophecy. It requires recognizing that the structure visible in history increasingly resembles the structure Revelation exposes and judges. That means the beast system isn't a fantasy waiting to appear one day, it's an order that matures. One of the strongest observations in the chart is London-centered money power. By the 19th century, London isn't just a city, it's a money center, trade center, imperial center, credit center, maritime center, commercial nerve center, and banking nexus. And that matters because if a counterfeit order is maturing, armies alone aren't enough to explain it. Debt, trade, credit, shipping, reconstruction, treaty leverage, and later central bank continuity have to be accounted for. That's why London is a key note. Not because the city itself is mystical, but because it shows the concentration of merchant Babylon and early financial technocratic control in one hub. Merchant Babylon logic is one of the strongest parts of the whole framework because power no longer rules through conquest only, but through appetite. Trade, luxury, extraction, dependency, market-based ordering, commercial civilization. This is why Revelation 18 matters so much. The merchants mourned because the system wasn't only political, it was economic religion. When modern history shows commercial empires, trade routes shaping war, banking houses carrying imperial influence, resources and ports and canals shaping outcomes, luxury and extraction operating together, and civilization increasingly organized around the flow of money instead of covenant order, the Babylon pattern becomes historically legible. The counterfeit order also transitions. It doesn't stay in raw imperial form forever. Direct empire weakens, but control doesn't disappear. It reorganizes. The old visible imperial order increasingly gives way to financial leverage. Finance can trap without occupying, discipline without invading, centralize without visibly conquering, restructure nations through debt, govern through dependence, and normalize the process as necessity. That's a more advanced form of control. And from the standpoint of Revelation, it makes sense because beast rule should mature, not stay primitive. Bureaucracy hardens the order further. Rule becomes administrative. It's managed through records, ministries, classifications, procedures, formal processes, standardization, legal machinery, expert committees, and institutional memory. This hardening matters because it makes the counterfeit order durable. Charismatic rulers can fall, empires can fracture, markets can crash. Bureaucracy keeps going. It remembers, preserves, standardizes, and reproduces the order. Central banking and debt leverage then become one of the strongest bridges between the historical chart and anti-covenant order. Debt becomes a chain, Rescue becomes leverage, liquidity becomes power, and panic becomes opportunity for consolidation. That's why if you look at 1895 to 1907 to 1913 to 1917, that chain matters because the broader pattern is hard to miss. Crisis, rescue, centralization, war, post-war restructuring. From a covenant standpoint, debt is critical because true release breaks debt dependence. If a system deepens debt dependence rather than releases it, structurally it's moving away from covenant order and toward anti-covenant order. Then comes technocratic continuity. This is where the modern system becomes hard to recognize because it increasingly speaks in neutral language. Experts, management, optimization, stability, risk control, data, regulation, safety, efficiency, and coordination. All that sounds neutral, and that's why it's dangerous. Technocratic rule doesn't usually present itself as beastly. It presents itself as reasonable. It says, this is best practice, it's necessary, how complexity must be managed, and it's for the public good. But a technocratic order can preserve anti-covenant structures while appearing non-ideological. That's one of the deepest masks of the counterfeit system. Finally, the chart suggests movement toward direct enforcement. Not that every detail of Final Beast enforcement is already fully complete, but that the machinery for it is already built. The world already has centralized systems, economic control levers, bureaucratic hardening, technocratic continuity, merchant Babylon appetite structures, and a cultural normalization of managed dependence. That means the transition from system management to direct compliance pressure isn't a giant leap, it's the next escalation. That's why the framework matters for Revelation. It doesn't prove every event is final fulfillment. It shows that the shape is real, and that's enough to matter greatly because it shows the beast isn't invented at the end, it's revealed at the end. Now, let's talk about true Jubilee versus counterfeit Jubilee, because this is one of the deepest parts of the whole build. The counterfeit system survives by offering false reset, false relief, false liberty, false peace, and false restoration. It survives by imitating release while preventing the real thing. It doesn't always say, here's your slavery. It says, here's your reform, here's your relief, here's your peace, here's your reset. And then what does it actually deliver? Deeper dependence, deeper concentration, deeper bondage, deeper control, and deeper centralization. This is why the logic of true Jubilee has to be restored. A true Jubilee isn't symbolic sentiment. It's not just new beginnings. It's not vague positivity or a slogan. It means debt release, land return, inheritance reset, captives freed, and rightful order restored. It means concentrations break, long-term distortions are interrupted, what was stolen isn't merely forgotten, what was fractured isn't merely spiritualized, and rightful order is restored in real terms. That's why Jubilee is dangerous to the counterfeit order. The counterfeit order is built on accumulation without release, concentration without return, and control without restoration, debt without cancellation, land without rightful inheritance, and captivity without liberty. So a true Jubilee isn't merely one theme among many, it's the death of the counterfeit system. And this is where the connection has to be made even more explicit. Anti-Jubilee structure is the glue that holds Babylon, the beast and false peace together. Babylon offers false abundance without release. The beast offers false order without release. False peace offers managed calm without release. And that's why all three belong together. They're different faces of the same anti-Jubilee logic. That's why Revelation has to end in Jubilee logic. If Revelation ends in judgment but not in release, covenant hasn't been completed. If it ends in punishment but not restoration, covenant hasn't been completed. If it ends in the destruction of Babylon but not in inheritance restored, covenant hasn't been completed. Revelation isn't there merely to show collapse, it's there to restore order. And order can't be restored unless the anti-Jubilee system is broken. The counterfeit system is anti-release, not just anti-truth, not just anti-righteousness, anti-release. It's trying to prevent real sovereignty, real release, real decentralization, and real restoration. Sovereignty in covenant terms isn't just political independence, it's life restored under Yahuwah's rule within rightful boundaries, under rightful time, with rightful judgment, and under rightful inheritance. The counterfeit system hates that because of people with restored inheritance and restored order are harder to manage. That's why the system trends against release. It offers fake freedom while preserving the mechanisms of bondage. It offers fake peace while deepening dependency. It offers fake resets while protecting concentrations of power. And that's what makes it anti-Jubilee. False reset isn't the same thing as true release. False reset says the system is being corrected. True release says the system that caused the distortion is being broken. False reset says things will be adjusted. True release says rightful order will be restored. False reset says relief will be administered from above. True release says inheritance will be returned and concentration broken. False reset leaves the system intact but looking kinder. True release means the system loses what it stole. And that distinction changes Revelation. Babylon's collapse becomes destruction of the anti-release order. The New Jerusalem becomes restored order. Resurrection becomes release from final captivity. The removal of curse becomes the final undoing of anti-Jubilee existence. And Revelation must end in Jubilee because the covenant can't end in managed crisis, endless warning, endless fear, or beast exposure only. It must end in release. That's why Revelation 21 and 22 look the way they do. The city's there, the river's there, the tree's there, the curse is gone, the servants reign, and it feels like restoration of beginning and liberation of what was bound because it is the final Jubilee. The system cracks under true Jubilee pressure because the thing it was built to stop is a thing Scripture says must happen. That's why the counterfeit system always looks the strongest right before it starts to crack. The more release approaches, the more the counterfeit must overreach to hold the structure together. More control, more pressure, more false legitimacy, more manipulation, more managed crisis, more artificial reset language, more attempts to stabilize what should be collapsing. This is why the final period isn't just a moral crisis, it's an architectural crisis. The counterfeit order reaches the limit of what it can hold. It can still threaten, intensify, enforce, and distort, but it can't produce what covenant requires. It can't produce true Jubilee. And that's why it must be judged. Now, let's talk about the 40, 45, 50 corridor. because this timing corridor is one of the strongest keys in the whole framework, because it gives a way to read the final pressure sequence without turning Daniel 12 into random number mysticism. People will usually either flatten the numbers into meaningless symbolism or turn them into obsessive arithmetic. Both approaches miss the point. The numbers aren't there for fascination, they're there because the final corridor is structured. And this has to be said plainly. The 40, 45, 50 corridor isn't private numerology, it's not arbitrary number play. It's a structured reading key emerging from covenant timing logic already present in Daniel 12 and Revelation's closing sequence. It grows out of the architecture. It's not pasted onto it. This corridor uses covenant release logic, but it shouldn't be confused with the 12 main pulse structure itself. So the 40, 45, 50 architecture gives the final phase a shape. It tells what kind of pressure is active, what kind of separation is active, what kind of emergence is active, and what kind of release is being approached. That's why it's such a useful timing key, because it turns Daniel 12 from a mystery block into a structured transition corridor. And once that happens, Revelation 14 to 22 become much easier to read in sequence. 40. 40 is one of the most important structural secondary pulses in Scripture. It means testing, transition, exposure, wilderness, formation under pressure. And that doesn't mean that every 40 is identical. It means that 40 consistently marks a zone where the old order is stressed, the surface is stripped away, and what's real begins to show. So zone 40, it's always going to represent testing, wilderness, strain, exposure, corruption, saturation, or the making of watchmen. It's one of the opening pressure zones. The world hasn't yet reached open release, final public separation, or explicit closure, but the strain begins to show. That's what it means. Systems become unstable. Corruption becomes harder to hide. Structures lose moral coherence. False shepherds begin showing their fraudulence. People who were once comfortable begin to feel the strain. Hidden weaknesses stop staying hidden. And this isn't the release phase, it's the pressure phase. And one of the most important things happening here isn't public collapse only, but remnant formation. Watchmen are being made. Zone 40 to 45 is where the separating wind begins. Seal activity starts. False shepherds are exposed. Pressure rises. And this interval is no longer just strain, it's separation. What was mixed starts to divide. What was hidden starts to be sorted. What was tolerated starts to be exposed. What was blurry starts to sharpen. False leadership can't hide as easily. Counterfeit spiritual authorities, institutional gatekeepers, those who normalize compromise, those who bless the counterfeit, begin to be exposed. Seal activity makes sense here. Not full annihilation, not final purge yet, but the beginning of visible separation and covenant distinction. Zone 45 is the refinement corridor. It's trumpet pressure. Watchmen emerge publicly. Obedience becomes instinctive. This is one of the most important thresholds in the whole map. Pressure is no longer only forming people in secret, it begins to reveal them. Watchmen emerge publicly. Their role becomes visible, their speech becomes necessary, their warnings are no longer optional background noise. Trumpets are warning and intensification, public declaration, covenant warning at a level that can't be ignored quietly anymore. And one of the strongest marks of this phase is that obedience becomes instinctive. The pressure has burned off enough compromise that covenant reflex becomes cleaner. Zone 45 to 50 is the bowl corridor, crushing of corrupt systems, governments fall, false religion implodes, stabilizers emerge. This is where pressure becomes crushing and the system is no longer merely warning, it's breaking. The trumpets warned, bowls crush, governments fall, false religion implodes, systems fracture, structures that look permanent begin to disintegrate. The counterfeit order can no longer hold itself together under the weight of what has matured inside it. This is also where stabilizers emerge, not saviors of the system, but stabilizers of people under collapse. Protectors, teachers, shepherds, interpreters, preservers of covenant order, anchors for communities under pressure. This interval isn't easy because leadership gets heavy, not glory, but responsibility. Zone 50 is release, inheritance, restoration, and return. It's not symbolic comfort, but actual release. It's not vague hope, but restoration. It's not sentimental inheritance, but actual inheritance. The earlier zones are pressure, separation, refinement, and crushing. Zone 50 is the reason they exist at all. Without 50, the corridor would be suffering without covenant resolution. But the purpose of the whole process isn't endless pressure, it's rightful release. At 50, the audit gives way to release. The counterfeit loses what it stole, inheritance is restored, the remnant move from surviving into possessing. Creation moves from curse toward restoration. Covenant order reappears. That's why Daniel 12 becomes much more stable under this model. Trouble like never before, deliverance waiting, and blessing at the far threshold, and inheritance at the end. And Daniel 12 isn't just predicting a bad time, it's mapping the movement from structural strain into final release. And Revelation 14 to 22 become clearer too. Revelation 14 is visible separation and harvest threshold. Revelation 15 and 16 are bowl, corridor, and purge. Revelation 17 and 18 are collapse of false order. Revelation 19 is union and rightful kingship. Revelation 20 is kingdom, resurrection, and judgment. Revelation 21 and 22 are final release, inheritance, and restored creation. Now, let's talk about two resurrections. Revelation 20 gets flattened all the time because people collapse death, life, judgment, kingdom, resurrection, and new creation into one vague spiritual blur. But the framework doesn't allow that. There are two resurrection dimensions in the system, not two unrelated doctrines, two dimensions. Resurrection 1 is inner covenant resurrection. It's the death of ego, pride, false self, rebellion, self-rule, and old identity. It's re-entry through obedience, surrender, purification, testing, and covenant alignment. This isn't optional spirituality, it's one of the main realities of the covenant system. Nobody reaches final inheritance while remaining inwardly untouched. Nobody comes through the final pressure corridor unchanged inside. The false self dies, pride dies, vengeance dies, double-heartedness dies, self-rule dies, compromise dies, and what's born is obedience, humility, clarity, endurance, remnant identity, and covenant stability. That's resurrection 1. It's not minor self-improvement, it's death and reconstitution. Resurrection 2 is final bodily resurrection at the great jubilee. The dead rise, books are open, names are judged, creation is restored, mortality is broken, and new creation, humanity, is established. This isn't the same as inner transformation, even though it's related to it. Resurrection 2 is final kingdom resurrection, bodily, judicial, cosmic, and covenantal, and it's tied to inheritance. The distinction matters because Scripture breaks or speaks in both dimensions. Sometimes it speaks about inner covenant transformation. Sometimes it speaks about final bodily restoration. Sometimes it speaks by pattern of both, but not at the same level. Without the distinction, people either over spiritualize the end or under spiritualize discipleship. They either say resurrection is just inner awakening or say nothing counts as resurrection until the last day. And both are distortions. Resurrection 1 matters because it prepares the human heart to stand in judgment. The deepest question isn't merely who survives collapse, but what kind of person survives judgment. If pride still rules, pressure exposes pride. If fear still rules, pressure exposes fear. If mammon still rules, pressure exposes mammon. If false shepherd dependence still rules, crisis exposes that too. That's why inner resurrection matters so much. It's for covenant survivability. It's threshold, exposure, wilderness, audit, release, and the inner path is structured. Resurrection 2 matters because covenant doesn't end at inward renewal alone. If it did, creation would remain under curse, bodies would remain mortal, death would remain unconquered in final form, and inheritance would remain incomplete. Daniel 12 and Revelation 20 sit on the second track most strongly. They're talking not primarily about private inward awakening, but final resurrection and final judgment. Daniel 12 ties together trouble, deliverance, and awakening from dust, and the distinction between the wise and the wicked, shining and final inheritance. Revelation 20 gives books opened, judgment proceeding, the dead addressed, final destinies resolved, kingdom order finalized, and death itself brought under final sentence. The relation between the two is simple. Resurrection 1 prepares a person to stand in Resurrection 2. Resurrection 1 is preparation. Resurrection 2 is consummation. Resurrection 1 is inner temple cleansing. Resurrection 2 is new creation embodiment. Resurrection 1 is the collapse of false self. Resurrection 2 is the raising of restored humanity. Resurrection 1 happens in discipleship under pressure. Resurrection 2 happens at the end of the age in final judgment and final release. That's why Revelation 20 shouldn't be flattened into one vague afterlife paragraph. It's the final kingdom resurrection chapter. And that's why the distinction matters so much. It preserves the seriousness of discipleship now and the seriousness of bodily restoration later. It preserves the present demand and the final hope. It preserves the inward death that must happen now and the outward raising that must happen then. Now that we've covered the two resurrections, let's cover what the remnant actually is. Because the remnant isn't a brand. The remnant isn't a people with secret information only. The remnant are the people formed under pressure into alignment. And that distinction matters because the remnant question gets abused constantly. Some use remnant like a social identity, a badge of superiority, or a way of saying we know what others don't know. But that's not the remnant. The remnant aren't defined first by what they know, they're defined by what they've become under covenant pressure. That's why the remnant question matters so much in relation to Revelation. If Revelation is treated as an information book, then the goal becomes decoding. But if Revelation is a covenant document, then the goal isn't just decoding, it's formation. The point isn't just to identify beasts, it's to form people who can stand when the beast system is exposed. That's why inner house audit comes first. Before the outer system is judged, the inner house is audited. Before Babylon falls, the assemblies are reviewed. Before the beast fully emerges, the lampstands are measured. The first question isn't can the people identify the beast? The first question is what kind of people are they? The system is supposed to produce identity reset, order, judgment skill, discernment, provision, stability, watchfulness, clean speech, and courage under collapse. That list matters because it shows the remnant isn't a mystical category floating in religious language, it's a formed human type. Identity reset means false identity has to die. False confidence, false belonging, false spiritual image, false loyalty, false religious self-definition. The remnant begin as people who go through crisis, stripping, conviction, and reordering until identity is no longer built on ego, tribe, performance, or branding. Order means inward order, household order, camp order, speech order, relational order, practical order, and covenant rhythm. Collapse reveals disorder quickly. The remnant can't be chaotic under pressure. Judgment skill means the ability to judge covenantally, to read situations clearly, to distinguish true from false, pressure from panic, repentance from performance, shepherds from hirelings, real provision from bait, and true release from counterfeit reset. Discernment is the trained ability to sense the actual nature of a thing, what spirit is operating here, what loyalty is being demanded, what compromise is hidden, what false peace is being sold, what counterfeit authority is being presented. The beast system often looks reasonable on the surface. Discernment keeps the remnant from being seduced by orderliness that is actually counterfeit. Provision matters because covenant life is embodied. Food, water, work, sustainability, basic care, practical continuity. A remnant that can identify symbols but can't survive materially under pressure isn't fully formed. Stability matters because intensity isn't depth. The remnant aren't just intense, they're stable in loyalty, identity, judgment, rhythm, obedience, speech, and endurance under stress. Watchfulness means sober awareness, not paranoia, not feverish obsession, disciplined attention, recognizing shifts in the environment, false shepherding, subtle compromise, danger patterns, covenant breaches, system changes, and timing pressures. Clean speech matters because collapse produces noise. Fear produces noise. Rumor produces noise. Ego produces noise. False prophecy produces noise. The remnant can't become another source of chaos. They must become more precise as pressure rises, not less. Courage under collapse means covenant courage. The courage to stay clear when things destabilize. Keep obeying when the system grows hostile. Keep speaking truth when truth is costly. Keep standing when compromise is rewarded. And keep carrying others when the false order is breaking. That's why the remnant matters so much. The point of revelation isn't just to reveal beasts, it's to form people who can stand when the beast system is exposed. The system isn't only exposing the beast, it's also exposing the remnant. The remnant aren't just the people who escape, they're the people the covenant process has actually produced. And that point has to be made even sharper. The remnant are formed, sealed, refined, and preserved through the sequence, not removed from it before the sequence matters. That matters because the whole architecture of Revelation treats the remnant as participants under covenant process, not spectators taken out before the real conflict begins. So, what frightens people about real revelation teaching? Because if revelation is taught the right way, it will unsettle people. Not because the teacher is theatrical, not because the symbols are dramatic, not because the beasts are strange, or because someone is trying to scare people. It unsettles people because real revelation teaching removes neutrality. Most people can handle revelation as long as it says or stays a chart, a curiosity, a mystery, a headline, a game, a future horror story, a religious puzzle, an argument about timelines, a source of excitement or entertainment. As long as it stays there, people can interact with it and keep distance. They can debate it, speculate about it, build content around it, and use it to sound deep or informed. But once Revelation is taught as a real covenant document with architecture, legal force, moral implications, historical relevance, remnant formation, and destruction of counterfeit order, it stops being neutral, and then people start to feel threatened by it. Because revelation no longer asks, "Can you decode me?" It asks, "What are you aligned to?" Real revelation teaching forces alignment questions. What system am I actually aligned with? What kind of order have I normalized? What kind of structure gives me comfort? What kind of peace have I accepted without testing whether it's covenantal or counterfeit? That's deeply uncomfortable because once that question is asked, a person can no longer assume that being against bad things is enough. The issue becomes what kind of life is actually being lived inside. A real revelation teaching exposes normalized counterfeit order as order, Babylon as civilization, false shepherding as spirituality, mammon as normal life, managed dependence as stability, anti-release rule as peace. And that's what frightens people. because then the problem isn't only some future visible crisis, the problem may already be built into what people call ordinary life. It also challenges counterfeit peace, what's being called peace that is actually counterfeit. The counterfeit system doesn't only rule through violence, it also rules through counterfeit peace. Peace without truth, peace without justice, peace without release, peace without restored inheritance, peace without covenant order. That's not peace, it's managed stability, and people love managed stability. It exposes Babylon dependence, where is life quietly nourished by Babylon patterned order while pretending to wait for Jerusalem. Babylon isn't just a city over there in the text, it's a civilizational pattern. Merchant civilization, luxury civilization, false sacred legitimacy, false stability, wealth without justice, order without release. It exposes the difference between formation and management. Am I being formed for release or managed for compliance? That's one of the deepest questions in the whole framework. A person is always being shaped by some system, formed into covenant stability, identity, obedience, discernment, courage, and release, or managed into dependency, fear, passivity, confusion, false peace, and eventual compliance. That's why people avoid this kind of teaching, not because they hate information, but because it's not only information, it's a summons. A real revelation teaching doesn't leave people comfortably in the position of observer. It summons, calls, indicts, measures, and asks for alignment. It removes the luxury of spectatorship. It turns people from spectators into participants under judgment. That's one of the deepest reasons that it frightens them. It also forces people to see that there aren't endless middle positions. Modern people want ambiguity, half distance, symbolic comfort without covenant demand, but Revelation presses things toward covenant division. Lamb or beast, bride or Babylon, witness or compromise, release or managed dependence, faithful endurance or compliance under pressure. Another reason people fear real revelation teaching is that it restores judgment as moral clarity. People nowadays prefer fog. They prefer situations where every side is complicated, nothing can be named clearly, truth is always deferred, accountability is softened, and evil is reframed as complexity. But Revelation doesn't leave things in fog. It judges clearly, not impulsively, not carelessly, clearly. That's why the unsettling effect of real revelation teaching isn't necessarily bad. Not all fear is manipulation. Sometimes fear is what happens when a lie begins to lose control. Sometimes it's what happens when fog begins to clear. Sometimes it's what happens when someone realizes the system they trusted isn't what they thought it was. The point isn't to chase fear, the point is to refuse to avoid clarity just because clarity disturbs. So, if revelation is taught the right way, it will unsettle people because it removes neutrality. It asks what people are aligned to, what peace has been accepted, what order has been normalized, what has been formed or has formed them, and what they are depending on, and whether they're being prepared for release or managed compliance. That's why people avoid a real teaching on Revelation, because it's not only information, it's a summons. Now, let's talk about why the remnant are formed through the sequence and not removed before it. This whole section matters because the Revelation framework doesn't fit the popular rapture narrative, and unless that's said directly, some people will still try to slip the old system back in through the side door. The issue isn't whether there's a final gathering. There is. The issue is when and how the faithful are treated in the sequence. The remnant and Revelation aren't absent from the process, they're present in it. They're audited, sealed, refined, preserved, and brought through it. That's one of the clearest implications of the book's architecture. The house first audit matters here. Revelation doesn't begin with covenant people disappearing, it begins with covenant people being measured. Chapters 1 to 3 aren't farewell letters to people who will vanish before the real pressure begins. They're inner house review, correction, warning, call to overcome. And that means the covenant people are still in the frame when the process begins. Then comes sealing before escalation. Revelation doesn't say the faithful are removed before the sequence matters. It shows the remnant being marked before deeper escalation. That's a completely different logic. Sealing isn't evacuation. Sealing is distinction inside the sequence. Then comes witness and endurance language. Witnesses stand, saints endure, the faithful are called to overcome. That language doesn't fit a framework where the true covenant people are already gone before the real confrontation matters. It fits a framework where the remnant are present under pressure and formed through it. This is where not appointed to wrath has to be handled carefully. Not appointed to wrath doesn't mean absent from all covenant process. It doesn't mean absent from all pressure, and it doesn't mean absent from all historical sequence. Revelation itself shows a difference between being present under covenant process and being objects of final wrath. The remnant are preserved through the sequence even while the system around them comes under judgment. Presence in the sequence isn't the same thing as being appointed to destruction in the sequence. And the resurrection and gathering logic matters too. In this framework, resurrection, inheritance, and final release sit at the end of the corridor, not at an earlier secret exit. The movement of Revelation pushes toward final resurrection and final gathering after the main sequence, not before the sequence becomes serious. That's why the architecture hurts the standard escape reading so badly. So the point has to be said plainly. The remnant are formed through the sequence, not removed before it. They're present for audit, present for sealing, present for witness, present for endurance, present for refinement, present for preservation, and then they are brought into final release. That's why the popular secret escape version doesn't fit the architecture very well. The architecture of Revelation treats the remnant as covenant participants under pressure, not absent observers waiting somewhere else while the real book happens to other people. So, to sum all of this up, Revelation isn't chaos. It's not a pile of disconnected symbols. It's not a fear manual. It's not a political guessing game. It's not a sensational chart for people addicted to headlines. Revelation is the final covenant procedure by which Yahuwah judges and dismantles a mature counterfeit governance order, separates the remnant, crushes Babylon, ends beast enforcement, raises the dead, and restores creation through jubilee release. That's the whole thing in one line. Once that's seen, the whole book changes. It stops being random and becomes ordered. It stops being theatrical and becomes judicial. It stops being vague and becomes architectural. It stops being detached from the rest of Scripture and becomes the final act of the same covenant system that has been running from the beginning. That's why Daniel matters. Daniel gives the sealed architecture. Revelation gives the unsealed execution. Daniel gives the skeleton. Revelation opens it. Daniel gives beast taxonomy, sanctuary breach, covenant accounting, invisible war, historical churn, transition corridor, and Revelation opens that skeleton into house audit, court opening, seals, trumpets, witnesses, dragon and beast exposure, harvest, purge, Babylon collapse, wedding, resurrection, and new creation. And Yahusha stands at the center of both, not at the edge, not as a devotional add-on, at the center. He is the Lamb, worthy to open the scroll. He is the one who walks among the lampstands. He is the one who fulfills Torah instead of abolishing it. He is the one who exposes false shepherds. He is the one who defines covenant loyalty. He is the one who judges Babylon. He is the one who defeats beast sovereignty. He is the one who raises the dead. He is the one through whom creation is restored. And that's the teaching. And if that's true, then Revelation isn't mainly about guessing headlines. It's about recognizing the counterfeit order, the covenant standard, the remnant path, and the release that must come after the final audit is complete. That's what the whole book is moving toward. Not endless collapse, not endless fear, not endless warning, release. That's why the end matters, because the end isn't just judgment, it's restored order. Babylon falls, the beast is judged, the false order is exposed, the remnant are preserved, the dead are raised, the curse is removed, the city descends, the river flows, the tree heals, inheritance is restored, presence fills everything, and that's not a side detail, that's the whole point. So the real question isn't whether Revelation is strange. The real question is whether it will be read according to its own architecture or according to the confusion projected onto it. Because once it's read correctly, it becomes very clear what it's demanding. It demands that the counterfeit be recognized. It demands that neutrality end. It demands that Babylon be named. It demands that the beast system be seen for what it is. It demands that the remnant be formed. And it demands that the people of Yahuwah stop mistaking managed dependence for peace. That's why this teaching matters, not because it's exotic, not because it's controversial, because it restores the order. And once the structure is restored, the fog starts to lift. The beasts are no longer random. Babylon is no longer vague. The judgments are no longer chaotic. The end is no longer disconnected from the beginning. The covenant is no longer hidden, and the remnant are no longer a slogan. The release is no longer sentimental. Everything locks. And once it locks, Revelation becomes one of the most terrifying and hopeful books in the whole Bible at the same time. Terrifying because it exposes the counterfeit and leaves no room for spectatorship. hopeful because it doesn't end in the beast, it ends in release, it ends in rightful rule, it ends in restored presence, it ends in the defeat of the counterfeit order, it ends in the New Jerusalem, it ends in Yahuwah dwelling with his people. It ends in what the counterfeit system was built to stop, but could never stop forever: the restoration of creation under the rule of Yahuwah through Yahusha. That's the full walk. That's the teaching. And that's why Revelation must be taught as architecture, not chaos.